and warm welcome from my end as well for today's Sustainability Community webinar under the title From Commitment to Progress, after the successful launch of the IFRA-IOFI Sustainability Charter. And this brings me back to 2016, where all of us here speaking and probably most of also the attendees of this webinar have met in Nice with the intention to launch something for sustainability of the flavor and fragrance industry. And coincidentally, I was also one of those speakers at that time in Nice, in my role at that time as the IOFI President. So it's even a bigger pleasure for me to speak today again to you as the IFRA Chairman. And it was also very interesting that shortly after our Nice event, I was offered the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer in the Symrise organization, which I took over with pleasure and drove forward in the past 4 years. And I have to say, sustainability has become really important after that moment of our launch for our industry and for the entire globe. It's an important topic also for trade associations because it can be executed very well in a pre-competitive way. And I think also during these times now, these difficult times of COVID-19 and the consequences for all of us, it has even become more important than in the past. At that time already, Anders Wijkman was also one of the speakers, and I'm really glad to announce him again. Anders is and was at that time already, I remember, the Honorary President of the Club of Rome International. He is also the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He is Policy Director of UNDP, the United Nations Development Fund, and he is definitely one of the key people globally who can give us insights about sustainability these days. So it's a real pleasure to hand over to you, Anders, and give us your insights, probably also of the past 3 to 4 years, which have gone down the road since we met for the first time in Nice. Over to you, Anders.
Thank you very much, Hans-Holger. Thank you for those nice words of introduction. And as you rightly say, we met in Nice almost 4 years ago. It feels as if it was almost yesterday, but of course, some time has passed. And at that seminar, the first steps were taken to develop this charter for your two industries. And I do recall the discussions we had, at times quite intense. And I'm very impressed that a few years later, the charter has now been signed by more than 100 companies. I also recall in the meeting in Nice that the question was posed why an industry charter was at all necessary. It was argued that some of the members of IFRA and the IOFI had already done a lot to make their business practices more sustainable. And I do recall that the natural response to such a question at the time, and I think it is as valid today, was of course that for all industry sectors, not least one that sources its materials from biodiversity-rich habitats, a common ground and denominator is very much needed with regard to both social and environmental challenges. And I believe the charter very well complements what some of the companies, primarily the big ones, have already done. Martina reminded us that the sustainability has been with us for quite a number of decades. It started in the 1960s with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Then came 1972 and the Club of Rome report Limits to Growth. The same year, we had the first ever international conference on the environment in Stockholm. I do remember it because I was a young member of parliament at the time. And we also know that a lot of good initiatives have been taken over the years, both by governments, civil society, science, and the business community. Local pollution has been reduced in many parts of the world. Nature reserves have been established. Chemical legislation has banned some of the substances that used to cause serious harm. But regretfully, if we look at the global situation today, we are in the midst of a deepening crisis, both regard to climate change, but as well with regard to ecosystem decline and biodiversity loss. And increasingly, people talk about a climate emergency or a planetary emergency. We know that the human ecological footprint is increasing year by year, and this cannot go on. This year, by the way, was an exception. Overshoot Day this year was moved a few weeks back compared to 2019. And that was the first time this happened since the countdown was introduced. But the reason was not that we are on our way to seriously transforming our production and consumption systems. Rather, it was, as both Martina and Hans-Holger reminded us, the effect of COVID-19, which has slowed down economic activity significantly. And I don't think anyone would like to resort to pandemics to save the climate and the environment. On the contrary, the negatives effect of COVID-19 are, as we know, extremely serious, not least among poor people. Hundreds of millions of jobs have been lost and an equal number of livelihoods have been destroyed. Let me quote the editor of Lancet, Richard Horton, who said a few months ago, COVID-19 has held a mirror up to our society and forced us to look at who really is vulnerable, who does really make society work, who has to literally put their lives on the line. And we have discovered something about ourselves that we can't hide any longer. So the question is, what do we do with that knowledge now? There is an intense discussion all over the world how to rebuild the economies after the pandemic. Some people say go back to normal, others say build back better. We can only hope the latter view will be gaining ground, because pandemics is but one of several serious risks that we face in this globalized world. I already referred to climate change and biodiversity loss, but we cannot ignore a financial system with debt levels exceeding 350% of global GDP. We cannot ignore the continued investment in nuclear weapons and armament. We cannot ignore exponential technologies that on the one hand offer fascinating opportunities. Just look at what the internet provides, but that also entail serious risks for privacy, for democracy, for monopolistic power among a few global tech companies, for new weapons, for superhumans, and for artificial intelligence outsmarting human intelligence. To manage future risks, COVID-19 must be acted upon not as a singular threat, but as one crisis in a series of possible shocks and long-term impacts to human health, to livelihoods, to prosperity and planetary stability. And given all the public money to be spent on recovery and stimulus, so far more than $10 trillion have been pledged, $10,000 billion. It would be utterly unwise, if not stupid, not to try to broadly address the many risks we are facing and to try to build a more resilient society. Luckily for us living in Europe, the European Union is preparing a program of action that, if implemented, should move the economy towards more rapid decarbonization and as well introducing significant measures to protect nature. Moreover, the transformation envisaged has to be inclusive. We have to address the rising inequalities in our societies, and we have to lend special support to the regions that tend to be the losers in the transition. The recovery package by the European Union is but one example. In December last year, the European Green Deal was launched, which has the same orientation and focus, a green and just transition. It aims to accelerate the shift to a zero carbon economy and to restore biodiversity. At least 30% of the recovery plan is aiming at climate-friendly measures. The rest of the package will be guided by a principle of doing no harm. And the main priority areas are building efficiency, clean technology investment, low carbon vehicles, sustainable land use, and a just transition. Regretfully, the situation is not the same in other parts of the world. In the US, for instance, President Trump is doing his best to undo existing environment and climate legislation. And the stimulus packages in the US so far seem to have had the opposite of greening as their objective. It is a tragedy for the US, but unfortunately also for the world. But all in all, there is no way back. Mankind must do whatever possible to restore the climate balance and stop ecosystem decline and the loss of biodiversity. And I'm quite optimistic that the European Union will lead the way, first and foremost in Europe, but as well set an example for the rest of the world. The legislation that is being considered includes several measures that will have implications far beyond Europe. One such example will be border tariffs for products that have been produced without concern for climate protection. Another is a product policy, which is likely to require that products put on the European market have to comply with circular economy principles. That is to say, should be built for longevity, so no obsolescence built in, and be easy to reuse and recycle. Moreover, I believe development assistance is likely to focus much greater attention on the South, on technology leapfrogging, so as to help low-income countries avoid being stuck in the carbon economy and indeed helping them to regenerate nature. Against this background, the timing of the Sustainability Charter is, in my opinion, perfect, because the Charter demonstrates that the fragrance and flavor industries are well prepared to meet increasingly ambitious climate and environment as well as social requirements. The focus areas of the Charter are well selected and, if pursued, will help companies to move towards respecting both the Sustainable Development Goals in general and more specifically the planetary boundaries. Biodiversity and ecosystem services is at the core of many business practices of the fragrance and flavor industry. As we know, biodiversity loss is a serious challenge. We have talked about the threats to biodiversity for decades by now, but to most people it seems to be an abstraction. I hope and believe that the pandemic has changed the situation. If we look back, we know that human activity over the last 50 years has dramatically altered our planet's landscapes, oceans, and atmosphere, transforming as much as half of the world's tropical forest into agriculture and human settlements. Biodiversity loss is both accelerated by climate change and at the same time exacerbates it by reducing nature's ability to sequester carbon and to adapt to climate change impacts. And science tells us that about 1/3 of emerging diseases are the product of these rapid changes in land use. As people are pushed into contact with wildlife they would once have rarely encountered. Our current approach is to wait for outbreaks to start and then design drugs or vaccines to control them. But as we have seen with COVID-19, this approach isn't good enough. While we wait for a vaccine, hundreds of thousands of people have died, and by now more than 25 million have been affected. Nature fundamentally underpins human health, well-being, and prosperity. We need to appropriately value nature and the service it provides as we make decisions, and recognize, of course, that the business case for biodiversity is compelling. The benefits of restoring natural resources outweigh the costs tenfold, and the cost of inaction is even high. Regretful as it is, mainstream economics give limited attention to ecosystem services and biodiversity and the functioning of the natural world. They make very little distinction between financial and industrial capital on the one hand and natural capital on the other. These types of capital are treated as near perfect substitutes for one another. The reasoning and thinking seems to be, as long as financial capital increases, we are fine. But ladies and gentlemen, we cannot eat money. and money cannot regenerate more orangutans or clean water or a stable climate once overuse or pollution have gone too far. Furthermore, conventional economic models, linear in nature as they are incapable of addressing and guiding society with regard to the non-linearity of natural systems, such as the climate system. Scientists keep reminding us of tipping points in relation both to vital ecosystems like rainforests, think of the Amazonas, soils and lakes, and the climate system. And once such tipping points are crossed and the original ecosystem has flipped or the climate system is severely destabilized, the damage may be irreversible. So if we are to prevent future pandemics, we have to reassess our relationship with nature. And this should begin with reducing the rampant consumption that drives deforestation and wildlife exploitation. We'll also need to remove viral risk species from wildlife markets. Think of the wet markets in many parts of Asia. We have to crack down on illegal wildlife trade and work with communities to find alternatives. And we should be putting more pressure on industries that harvest timber and wildlife products, rewarding corporate sustainability like the Charter, and legislating against reckless consumption. When studying the focus areas of your Charter, I'm struck by the fact that the major challenges of sustainability are very well covered. The first focus area deals with responsible sourcing, and the fragrance and flavor industries play an important role with regard both to the health of often fragile ecosystems and of rural populations. The sourcing of natural flavors and fragrances define the living conditions for perhaps as many as 20 million smallholders. And the way the sourcing is done has a clear impact on ecosystems. The Charter is very clear on both aspects: to foster economic health of farmers and local communities with fair and long-term partnerships, and to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of ecosystems. What I would have expected to be included in the Charter would have been a reference to the ongoing discussion regarding synthetics versus naturals. Some stakeholders warn against the development of synthetics and its potential consequences for millions of smallholders, that is to say, the loss of jobs. Others claim that synthetics is the way to move to relieve the pressure on nature. The reason is that even natural resources can have a big negative impact on the environment. While, for instance, lavender from grass can be produced in needed quantities with minimal impact on land or people, the same cannot be said for other important inputs such as vanilla, sandalwood, and patchouli. As Kari Arienti, founder of and perfumer at Aroma Knowledge, recently said, there just is not enough arable land to grow certain things. I'm not competent to make a specific judgment on the balance between synthetics and naturals. I guess, as always, a balanced approach would be the best way forward. But as I understand it, many of the finest fragrances today combine synthetic scent molecules with traditional essential oils derived from flowers, roots, fruits, wood, and moss. The important thing seems to be that natural sourcing systems are sustainable and that they operate well within the planetary, social, and ethical boundaries, and that efforts are made to help improve the standard of living among millions of smallholders. The second focus area deals with the overall environmental footprint and climate change. Here, resource efficiency and circularity are major elements, as well as, of course, green chemistry. We are in the early stages of both circularity and green chemistry. Too often, the circular economy is portrayed primarily as a question of recycling. Recycling is important, but only one of many features. More important is the design of products, product life extension, and the cost structure of the economy. It is, in fact, very often less expensive to source virgin materials than secondary materials. The third focus area addresses the well-being of employees and gives special attention to health and safety, to equal opportunities, and the provision of opportunities to upgrade professional skills. The latter part is of special importance in a situation where technology change is more rapid than ever. The fourth focus area deals with product safety. It needs no special comment, an obvious priority for any responsible company. Finally, the fifth and last focus area is devoted to transparency. Special emphasis is given to reporting to international bodies and to stakeholder dialogues throughout the value chain. Here I would think that issues related to synthetics and naturals would emerge, not least from the NGO side. Now, friends, let me conclude by again commending IFRA and IFRA-I for developing and adopting the Sustainability Charter. It will no doubt assist members of the two associations to move their business practices more in line with sustainability principles. However, we have to be clear that the Charter is rather general in nature. The devil is always in the details. What remains during the implementation phase will be to translate the principles of the Charter into operational activities that correspond with the SDGs and more specifically with the planetary boundaries. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the fragility of our health, social, economic, financial, and political systems. It is now more important than ever to work together towards a resilient economy focused on greater sustainability, well-being, and regeneration of nature, and the aim to deliver a better balance between people, planet, and prosperity. The good thing is that modern society has acquired an amount of economic wealth, scientific knowledge, and technological capacities that should enable us to implement most of the transformations needed. However, for that to happen, we need to address some of the most obvious shortcomings of our present economic model. The way we value nature is one of the areas where reform is urgently needed. Another barrier to change is short-termism in all its forms, political, economic, and financial, as well as at the consumer level. In fact, we live in a culture of instant gratification, and this has serious implications, both for future generations and for the natural world. A key issue for all of us will be how we can turn a culture of short-termism into a culture where responsibility for the long term is the norm. For that to happen, we need to rethink our values, but as well economic policy frameworks. I have already referred to the valuation of nature. Another key issue will be to stop discounting the future. For the business community, the era of quarterly reporting has to come to an end. The financial sector has to rethink its objectives from short-term profit maximization to long-term sustainable returns on investments. Finally, we need, of course, a political system that is not dominated by concerns for the next election. Great challenges indeed, but I'm an optimist. I'm confident we can make the necessary transition. The question really is how deep the crisis we already face have to be for the necessary action to take place. The pandemic was a serious shock. Let us hope we learn from that and take the chance of building back better for a more resilient society. Thank you for your attention.